$2.7 billion. That's how much money sits buried beneath the Arizona desert right now, spent on a copper mine that has never produced a single pound of metal. Rio Tinto and BHP have been digging, drilling, and waiting for over 20 years. And the copper they're chasing? 40 billion pounds of it? Worth more than $160 billion at current prices. Enough copper to supply 25% of America's entire demand for decades. But here's the thing. This isn't a story about geology or engineering. This is a story about what happens when the world's most valuable undeveloped copper deposit sits directly beneath one of the most sacred religious sites in North America. It's a story about billion-dollar mining giants, indigenous rights, courtroom battles that reached the Supreme Court, and a metal the entire green energy transition depends on. By the end of this video, you'll understand why resolution copper could become the most important mine in American history, or why it might never open at all. You'll learn exactly how much copper lies beneath Arizona soil, why two mining giants have gambled billions on a hole in the ground, and what the destruction of ancient Aboriginal caves in Australia has to do with an Apache sacred site in the Sonoran Desert. I'm going to take you nearly 7,000 feet underground, to the bottom of the deepest mine shaft in the United States. I'll show you exactly how block caving works, and why this technique will eventually create a 2-mile-wide crater on the surface. And I'll explain why a 2014 defense spending bill holds the key to everything. Let's start with where this copper actually sits. 60 miles east of Phoenix, near a tiny town called Superior, the Resolution copper deposit lies between 5,000 and 7,000 feet beneath the Earth's surface. That's more than a mile underground. To put that in perspective, the deepest parts of this deposit sit nearly twice as far down as the Empire State Building is tall. The deposit itself contains an estimated 1.787 billion metric tons of ore at an average grade of 1.5% copper. For context, most copper deposits in the southwestern United States run about 0.5% copper. Resolution's grade is 3 times richer than average. Geologists rank it among the top 20 porphyry copper deposits on the planet in terms of size and contained metal. In addition to copper, the deposit contains approximately 0.037% molybdenum, a metal used in high-strength steel alloys. While molybdenum represents a minor component of the total value, it provides an additional revenue stream that improves project economics. The copper-molybdenum combination is typical of porphyry deposits formed by the same hydrothermal processes. How did so much copper end up so far underground in one place? The answer goes back 65 million years. During the late Cretaceous period, massive hydrothermal eruptions pushed mineral-rich fluids through fractures in the Earth's crust. Think of it as a volcanic eruption happening beneath the surface rather than above it. These superheated fluids deposited copper, molybdenum, and other metals into the surrounding rock. The Copper Triangle region where Resolution sits is particularly fertile for porphyry deposits. 3 separate hydrothermal events occurred during this period, each adding to the mineral concentration. The geology is almost uniquely favorable. The copper was buried deep enough to be preserved, but pushed close enough to the surface to be theoretically accessible. Other deposits in the region either eroded away or remained too deep to reach economically. Over millions of years, extensional faulting stretched the Earth's crust, chopping up these deposits and tilting blocks of rock like toppling dominoes. This geological activity pushed the copper-bearing rock closer to the surface. Then, about 18 million years ago, an eruption from the nearby Superstition caldera buried the entire area under volcanic ash, creating a protective cap of tuff that preserved the deposit beneath what is now called Oak Flat. The climate helped too. Southwestern North America has been relatively dry for the past 200 million years. Without significant rainfall and erosion, the copper stayed buried rather than being exposed and weathered away. This combination of geological forces created a copper deposit that's both unusually rich and unusually deep. University of Arizona geologist Mark Barton describes it as very large and exceptionally rich, certainly in the top 20 of these kinds of deposits around the world in terms of size, and contained metal. Resolution Copper Mining is a joint venture between two of the world's largest mining companies. Rio Tinto holds 55% ownership, while BHP holds the remaining 45%. These aren't small players. Rio Tinto is the world's second largest mining company, with a market capitalization exceeding $120 billion. BHP is even larger, typically ranking as the world's most valuable mining company by market cap. The joint venture structure matters for understanding the project's finances. Every dollar spent on Resolution gets split proportionally between the two partners. Rio Tinto's share of the more than $2 billion invested so far comes to roughly $1.1 billion. BHP has contributed approximately $900 million. Both companies fund the project from their existing cash flows rather than taking on project-specific debt. Neither company discloses Resolution Copper as a separate line item in quarterly earnings reports, treating it instead as part of broader capital expenditure programs. This accounting approach shields investors from detailed scrutiny of how much money flows into a project that generates zero revenue. The $2 billion figure comes from official company statements rather than line-by-line financial disclosure. The ownership arrangement dates back to the project's origins in 2004, when Resolution Copper Mining assumed control of the historic Magma mine site from BHP. BHP had acquired the Magma Copper Company in 1996, just as the original Magma mine was shutting down after 86 years of continuous operation. Rather than abandon the site entirely, BHP recognized the potential of a much deeper copper deposit that magma geologists had identified years earlier. In 1972, magma geologists first recognized signs of a deep copper deposit south of their existing mine workings. The company's exploration teams noticed geological anomalies suggesting mineralization at unprecedented depths. Exploration drilling began, and by 1995, Magma had confirmed the existence of an enormous porphyry copper deposit at extreme depth. The drilling results exceeded expectations, revealing ore grades and deposit size that would make Resolution one of the most significant discoveries in decades. The timing proved unfortunate for Magma Copper Company. The company's surface operations were exhausted after nearly a century of production. Financial resources were stretched thin from the cost of maintaining operations during a period of depressed copper prices. Management lacked the capital required to develop such an ambitious underground project, which would clearly require billions of dollars in technology that didn't yet exist. BHP's acquisition brought new resources, but also new complications. Developing the Resolution deposit would require technology and investment on a scale that no single company wanted to shoulder alone. The technical challenges of mining at such extreme depths, combined with regulatory uncertainty and the multi-decade timeline to production, made a partnership attractive. The joint venture with Rio Tinto, formalized in 2004, brought together two mining giants with complementary expertise in large-scale underground operations, and the combined financial strength to spend billions on a project that might take decades to reach production. To understand Resolution's potential, you have to understand the history of copper mining in this part of Arizona. The Pioneer Mining District has been producing metals since 1875, when the King Mine began pulling silver from the ground. The Silver Queen Mine, which would eventually become the famous Magma Mine, started operations that same year. By the time Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Superior was already an established mining camp with a growing population of miners and their families. William Boyce Thompson, a mining engineer turned Wall Street trader, purchased the Silver Queen Mine in 1910 for $130,000 and incorporated the Magma Copper Company. Thompson hired field engineer Fred Flint to examine the property and mining engineer Henry Crum to conduct a detailed evaluation. Crum's favorable report convinced Thompson and his partner George Gunn to proceed with the acquisition. Thompson would later found Newmont Mining Corporation, one of the world's largest gold producers, but Magma became one of his signature successes. The mine's underground ore proved extraordinarily rich, running as high as 6% copper in some zones, 12 times the grade of Resolution's deposit. This exceptionally rich ore allowed Magma to operate profitably, even during periods when lower-grade mines struggled to cover their costs. Magma's operations expanded rapidly through the early 20th century. A 200-ton-per-day concentrator came online in April 1914, using Wilfley gravity tables and Callow flotation cells to produce copper concentrate. A 2,600-foot aerial tramway connected the Flint Tunnel portal to the new mill site. The company deepened its shafts continuously, following the ore deeper into the earth as the upper levels were depleted. The magma mine eventually grew to include 9 separate shafts spread across miles of underground workings. The company built its own railroad, the Magma-Arizona Railroad, in 1914 to connect Superior with the Southern Pacific Line, 28 miles away. Construction cost $160,000 and took until May 1915 to complete. A smelter followed in 1924, allowing Magma to process copper on site rather than shipping concentrates elsewhere for refining. At its peak, Magma Copper Company employed thousands of workers and ranked as the 8th largest copper producer in the United States by 1950. The company's San Manuel operation, acquired in 1944, eventually became even larger than the original Superior mine. At peak production, Magma's San Manuel smelter processed 25% of all copper ore in the United States, making the company a dominant force in American copper production. Over its 86-year operating life, the Magma mine produced 1,299,718 short tons of copper, along with 36,550 short tons of zinc, nearly 686,000 ounces of gold, and 34.3 million ounces of silver. The mine employed thousands of workers and built the town of Superior into a thriving community of more than 8,000 residents at its peak. Multiple grocery stores, department stores, lumber yards, hardware stores, bars, churches, a hospital, and 3 new car dealerships served the mining families. Superior's diverse population included workers from across the globe: Caucasians, Hispanics, Eastern Europeans, Syrians, Lebanese, Chinese, and Native Americans, all found employment in the mine and settled in the growing town. The community remained remarkably insulated from the Great Depression, with more than 80% of the male population employed by Magma, even during the darkest economic times. Hard times, residents recalled, forged friendships in the sweat of labor and the blood of shared sacrifice. Thompson himself grew enamored with the landscape around Superior. In the early 1920s, he built a winter home overlooking Queen Creek. Recognizing the importance of plants and plant science, he founded Boyce Thompson Arboretum just west of Superior in 1924, establishing Arizona's oldest and largest botanical garden. The Living Museum today holds over 4,000 species of arid land plants on 372 pristine acres of Sonoran desert. The mine's closure in 1996 devastated Superior. Without copper payrolls flowing through the local economy, businesses shuttered and residents departed. The population dropped by more than half, from over 8,000 to fewer than 3,000. Homes stood empty. Storefronts went dark. The town that copper built seemed destined to join dozens of other abandoned mining camps scattered across the Arizona desert. When Resolution Copper arrived in 2004, the company inherited not just mineral rights and underground infrastructure, but also a community that desperately wanted mining to return. Town leaders welcomed the prospect of renewed economic activity. Longtime residents whose families had worked in the Magma mine for generations saw Resolution as a chance to restore Superior's prosperity. The company positioned itself as a partner in community revival, rather than merely an outside corporation seeking mineral extraction. The infrastructure Resolution inherited included the historic No. 9 shaft, which Magma completed in 1973 as part of a major expansion program. That shaft reached 4,843 feet underground and connected to the Never Sweat Tunnel, an 8,600-foot horizontal passage linking the east and west plant sites. Magma spent $74 million on that expansion project, equivalent to several $100 million in today's dollars. The Never Sweat Tunnel got its name from the stifling heat workers encountered at depth, where temperatures made any physical exertion almost unbearable. Building the infrastructure to access copper more than a mile underground required engineering on an unprecedented scale. Resolution Copper spent 6 years and $540 million constructing the number 10 shaft, a 28-foot diameter concrete-lined tube that drops 6,943 feet straight down. That's the deepest single-lift mine shaft in the United States, and one of the deepest anywhere in the world. Construction began with drilling a pilot hole from surface to the target depth, then reaming it to the full diameter. Workers lined the shaft with concrete as they descended, creating a smooth tube capable of handling the extreme pressures at depth. The concrete must withstand not only the weight of rock all around, but also the constant presence of water seeping through fissures in the surrounding geology. Descending number 10 takes about 14 minutes at 500 feet per minute. Workers step into metal cages suspended from the headframe, a towering steel A-frame structure visible from miles away, and drop through darkness lit only by their headlamps. The concrete-lined walls rush past just inches away. Your ears pop repeatedly as atmospheric pressure increases with depth. Yellow decals in the cage warn of hazards using pictures of stick figures in various states of danger, arms caught between gears, falling rocks, and other perils. The engineering challenges compound as you go deeper. At 4,600 feet, roughly 400 feet below sea level, Resolution built a subterranean cooling station carved into the rock. Giant refrigeration coils chill the air, which has already lost the cooling effect of the surface ventilation system. 2 5-foot-wide fans blow the reconditioned air back down to the bottom of the mine through massive ducts. The heat comes from the earth itself. At the depths Resolution is mining, rock temperatures reach 140 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal gradient, the increase in temperature with depth, averages about 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 100 feet in this region. At nearly 7,000 feet, that adds up to temperatures that would quickly incapacitate unprotected workers. Resolution's refrigeration system must remove enormous quantities of heat continuously to maintain survivable conditions. Workers tapped into an ancient lake trapped thousands of feet underground by impermeable rock during construction. This aquifer, sealed away for geological ages, now leaks into the mine workings. Steaming hot water pours continuously from the walls. Managing this combination of extreme heat and water infiltration requires constant refrigeration and pumping. The dewatering system runs around the clock, and any failure would quickly flood the lower levels. The completed number 9 shaft now extends to 6,898 feet, making it the second deepest single-lift mine shaft in the United States, behind only Resolution's own number 10. The 2 shafts connect underground through a series of lateral tunnels and crosscuts. This provides redundant access so workers can exit through either shaft in an emergency and improved ventilation circulation through the workings. Resolution spent $200 million rehabilitating and deepening the historic number 9 shaft over multiple years. The work included reinforcing deteriorated sections, replacing corroded steel, upgrading the ventilation system, and extending the shaft from its original 4,800-foot depth to the current 6,898 feet. Crews drilled nearly 14,500 feet of rock, poured more than 560 cubic yards of concrete, and installed nearly 140 yards of shotcrete during the project. Together with the rehabilitated Never Sweat Tunnel and miles of additional underground development, these shafts form the backbone for what Resolution hopes will become North America's largest copper mine. The underground infrastructure represents a commitment of resources that only makes sense if the company fully intends to mine the deposit, regardless of how long the regulatory process takes. Resolution plans to extract copper using a technique called block caving, one of the most economical underground mining methods for large, deep deposits. In block caving, miners first construct a network of tunnels and funnels beneath the ore body. The development work takes years and requires precise engineering to create a collection system capable of handling millions of tons of broken rock. Once the infrastructure is in place, miners drill and blast an undercut, removing support from beneath a large section of rock. Gravity takes over. The unsupported ore fractures and collapses into the pre-built collection system. The process is sometimes compared to removing Jenga blocks from the bottom of a tower, causing the structure above to progressively fail and tumble down. The broken rock falls into draw points, essentially large funnels that channel ore into collection tunnels. Low-profile load-haul dump vehicles collect the material and transport it to underground crushers, which break it into smaller pieces. Conveyors then carry the crushed ore to ore skips that hoist it up the shaft to surface processing facilities. The entire system operates almost like a factory, with gravity providing much of the energy for moving rock. Block caving has been used in copper mines since the early 20th century. El Teniente in Chile, one of the world's largest underground copper mines, has used the technique for decades. North Parkes in Australia pioneered automated block caving systems. Grasberg in Indonesia, Palabora in South Africa, and New Afton in Canada all employ variations of the method. The technique offers production costs roughly 1/10 those of conventional underground mining methods. Cave mining operations can achieve production rates exceeding 100,000 tons of ore per day at mature operations. Resolution's current life of mine studies target a production rate in the range of 51,000 to 115,000 ore tons per day. The higher end of that range would place Resolution among the largest cave mining operations anywhere in the world, comparable to Codelco's massive Chuquicamata underground project in Chile. There's a catch, though. Block caving causes the surface above the mine to subside. As miners remove ore from below, the overlying rock progressively fractures and collapses into the void. This creates a subsidence zone that eventually reaches the surface, forming a depression that grows wider and deeper as mining continues. The process is gradual but inexorable. Once caving begins, it cannot be stopped. At Resolution, company projections indicate the subsidence crater could eventually reach 2 miles wide and 1,000 feet deep. The surface will not suddenly collapse into a giant sinkhole. Instead, the ground will gradually fracture and settle over the course of mining operations. But the end result is the same: complete destruction of the original surface topography within the subsidence zone. This is where Resolution's story collides with something far older than mining economics. The land above the copper deposit includes Oak Flat, known in Apache as Chichil Bildadakatil. For the Western Apache people, Oak Flat isn't just land. It's a sacred site where religious ceremonies have been conducted since time immemorial. The Apache consider Oak Flat a direct corridor to their creator, comparable in significance to Mount Sinai for Jews or Mecca for Muslims. Oak Flat hosts some of the most important Apache religious practices, ceremonies that cannot take place anywhere else. The sunrise ceremony, a multi-day coming-of-age ritual for young Apache women, requires specific plants, waters, and minerals that exist only at this location. The Apache girl coming of age must gather certain plants from Oak Flat, plants that Apaches believe possess special spiritual power. Substituting materials from another location would invalidate the ceremony. Sweat lodge ceremonies, gathering of sacred medicines, and other essential religious practices depend on Oak Flat's continued existence. Destroying Oak Flat would not merely inconvenience Apache worship, it would eliminate the physical location where their ceremonies take place. The site earned formal recognition when it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places as a Western Apache Traditional Cultural Property and National Historic District. Archaeological surveys documented continuous human presence going back thousands of years. The federal government protected Oak Flat from mining starting in 1955 under Public Land Order 1229, which withdrew the area along with 24 other campgrounds, lookouts, and administrative sites on national forest lands. That protection lasted nearly 60 years. Oak Flat Campground became a popular recreation area for hikers, rock climbers, and campers from the Phoenix metropolitan area. The massive boulders and unique desert landscape attracted outdoor enthusiasts who had no knowledge of the site's religious significance to the Apache or the copper lying miles beneath their feet. Then, in December 2014, a last-minute provision was inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act, a must-pass defense spending bill that Congress debates every year. Section 3003, sponsored by Arizona Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake, mandated a land exchange. Resolution Copper would receive 2,422 acres of national forest land, including Oak Flat. In return, the company would deed 5,344 acres of private land elsewhere in Arizona to the federal government. The land exchange provision had failed repeatedly as standalone legislation. Bills introduced in 2005, 2007, 2009, 2011, and 2013 never made it out of committee or failed to attract sufficient votes for passage. Congressional hearings examined the proposal over several years, with opponents arguing that sacred sites deserved protection and supporters emphasizing the economic benefits of domestic copper production. Unable to pass on its own merits, the measure was attached as a rider to the defense bill, a procedural maneuver that bundled it with hundreds of billions of dollars in military spending that no legislator could afford to oppose. The NDAA passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. President Obama signed it into law. Oak Flat's fate was sealed inside a bill about aircraft carriers and troop deployments. The Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, called herself profoundly disappointed with the Resolution Copper land swap provision, stating it showed no regard for lands considered sacred by nearby Indian tribes. Jody Gillette, Special Assistant to the President for Native American Affairs, indicated the Obama administration would work with Rio Tinto to determine how to protect tribal sacred areas. But the defense bill passed, and the land exchange became law. The law included a timeline. The federal government would complete an environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act. Once the final EIS was published, the land transfer would occur automatically 60 days later. No discretionary review, no opportunity for reconsideration, no presidential veto power. The clock would simply run out, and Oak Flat would become private property belonging to Resolution Copper. The bill also included provisions directing the Secretary of the Interior to manage Apache Leap Cliffs, which rise prominently east of Superior, so as to preserve their natural character. Resolution Copper surrendered mining rights over Apache Leap and deeded 110 acres of private land in the cliffs area to the federal government. Supporters argued these concessions demonstrated the company's good faith commitment to cultural preservation. The environmental review process began formally in 2013 when Resolution submitted its mine plan of operations to the U.S. Forest Service. The Tonto National Forest, part of the USFS, serves as the lead federal agency for reviewing the mine plan and preparing the environmental impact statement. What followed was years of studies, public meetings, and tribal consultations involving multiple federal and state agencies. The Forest Service examined potential impacts on water quality and quantity, air emissions, wildlife habitat, cultural resources, recreation opportunities, and community economics. Hundreds of government-to-government consultations took place between federal agencies and Native American tribes. Technical studies assessed everything from regional groundwater flows to endangered species habitat to noise impacts on neighboring properties. In August 2019, the Forest Service released a draft environmental impact statement laying out the projected impacts and possible alternatives. The document ran thousands of pages and analyzed multiple alternatives, ranging from the proposed mine plan to various modifications to a no-action alternative. The public comment period that followed generated extensive input from supporters, opponents, government agencies, tribal nations, and individual citizens. Resolution made modifications to its plans based on feedback. The company adjusted tailings facility designs, proposed additional water monitoring, and offered enhanced mitigation measures for cultural resources. Additional analysis continued through 2020, examining the implications of these changes and incorporating new information that emerged during the review process. January 2021 brought the final environmental impact statement, triggering the 60-day countdown to land transfer. The transfer was scheduled for March 11, 2021, during the final weeks of the Trump administration. President Trump's Interior Department planned to complete the exchange before leaving office. Then the calendar intervened. 9 days before the deadline, the Biden administration pulled back. The newly appointed Forest Service leadership withdrew the final EIS to allow for additional review and tribal consultation. The clock stopped with days to spare. Biden officials cited concerns about the adequacy of tribal consultation and the need to ensure the environmental review met all legal requirements. The Apache Stronghold, a coalition of Apache people, other Native Americans, and non-Native allies, filed suit against the federal government in 2021. Their legal argument centered on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, which prohibits the federal government from substantially burdening religious exercise without a compelling governmental interest achieved through the least restrictive means available. Destroying Oak Flat, Apache Stronghold argued, would end Apache religious practices forever and constitute exactly the kind of substantial burden Congress intended to prevent when it passed RFRA. The sunrise ceremony could not take place anywhere else. The sacred waters and plants existed only at Oak Flat. The Gan lived in the land itself. Mining would not merely inconvenience Apache worship. It would make their core religious practices impossible. The case wound through federal courts for years. A district court ruled against Apache Stronghold, finding that the land transfer did not coerce the Apache into acting contrary to their religious beliefs. A three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling on similar grounds. The legal question centered on how courts should interpret the phrase substantial burden in RFRA. The Ninth Circuit then agreed to rehear the case in banc, meaning all 11 active judges would consider it together rather than a randomly selected three-judge panel. Oral arguments in March 2023 drew extensive media attention and participation from dozens of tribal nations and religious organizations, filing friend of the court briefs. The case had become a major test of religious liberty protections for indigenous land-based faiths. On March 1, 2024, the Ninth Circuit issued its en banc ruling. By a vote of 6-5, the court held that the land transfer did not substantially burden Apache religious exercise under RFRA. The majority applied the Supreme Court's 1988 decision in Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association, which held that government actions on government land do not substantially burden religion even when they make religious practices impossible. The majority reasoned that while the transfer would significantly interfere with Apache religious practices, it did not coerce the Apache into acting contrary to their beliefs. The government was not requiring Apaches to abandon their faith, attend different religious services, or violate their religious principles. They remained free to worship their deities, even if the place where they worshipped no longer existed. 5 judges dissented in opinions spanning more than 100 pages. Chief Judge Mary Murguia wrote that the majority tragically erred in allowing the government to obliterate Oak Flat and prevent Western Apaches from ever again engaging in their religious exercise. The utter destruction of the sacred site used for religious ceremonies since time immemorial, she wrote, plainly constitutes a substantial burden. The dissent accused the majority of treating indigenous land-based religions as less worthy of protection than religions practiced in buildings with walls and steeples. If the government proposed demolishing the National Cathedral or leveling the Mormon Temple, the dissent suggested no court would conclude that believers could simply worship elsewhere. The Constitution should protect Apache sacred sites equally. Apache Stronghold petitioned the Supreme Court in September 2024. A 9,000-mile caravan traveled through 12 states to Washington, D.C., where supporters held a day of prayer on the Supreme Court steps. Former San Carlos Tribal Chairman Dr. Wensler Nosey Sr. led the group, calling Oak Flat the Mount Sinai of the Apache people. Religious leaders from multiple faiths joined the journey in solidarity. 52 tribal nations and organizations filed amicus briefs urging the court to hear the case. Religious liberty groups across the political spectrum, from conservative Christian organizations to progressive civil rights advocates, asked the justices to take the appeal. The case presented questions of law that divided lower courts and implicated the religious freedom of hundreds of tribal nations, whose sacred sites exist on federal land. On May 27, 2025, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The petition for certiorari was denied without explanation, as is customary when the court declines review. Justice Samuel Alito took no part in the consideration or decision. The remaining justices split on whether to accept the case, but only Justices Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas publicly dissented from the denial. Gorsuch's dissent called the decision a grievous mistake, with consequences that threatened to reverberate for generations. "No one before us disputes the significance of this case," he wrote, "nor could anyone sensibly do so. An ancient sacred site will be destroyed, replaced by a 2-mile-wide crater. The Apaches tell us without contradiction that the destruction of Oak Flat will inflict indescribable hardship on them." Gorsuch drew a pointed comparison. "Just imagine if the government sought to demolish a historic cathedral on so questionable a chain of legal reasoning," he wrote. "I have no doubt that we would find that case worth our time. Faced with the government's plan to destroy an ancient site of tribal worship, we owe the Apaches no less. They may live far from Washington, D.C., and their history and religious practices may be unfamiliar to many, but that should make no difference." The Trump administration, which had resumed office in January 2025, moved quickly after the Supreme Court decision. The Forest Service announced plans to republish the final environmental impact statement and proceed with the land transfer. On April 17, 2025, a 60-day notice signaled the republication was imminent. The government intended to reissue the final EIS and draft record of decision as early as June. Apache Stronghold returned to court seeking emergency relief. On May 9, 2025, a federal judge granted a temporary injunction blocking the land transfer while the Supreme Court considered the petition. The judge noted there is good reason to anticipate that the Supreme Court will take the case, though ultimately the court declined. After the court's denial, legal maneuvering continued in lower courts. In August 2025, another court order stopped the land transfer temporarily, as additional procedural challenges worked through the system. The judge dismissed Rio Tinto executive testimony about the $2.7 billion already spent on the project, and the $11 million per month in maintenance costs, as the company's voluntary choice insufficient to override the need for judicial review. As of late 2025, Oak Flat remains in federal hands, though for how much longer remains uncertain. Dr. Wensler Nosey Sr. has stated that Apache Stronghold will never stop fighting. Legal challenges continue. New legislation has been repeatedly introduced in Congress to repeal the 2014 land exchange provision, though none has gained sufficient support to pass. The legal battle over Oak Flat gains additional resonance from events half a world away. In May 2020, Rio Tinto, Resolution Copper's majority owner, legally destroyed 2 ancient rock shelters at Juukan Gorge in Western Australia to expand an iron ore mine. Those caves had been continuously occupied for 46,000 years, making them among the oldest evidence of human habitation anywhere on Earth. The Putukunti Kurama and Pinakura people had used Juukan Gorge for sacred ceremonies for thousands of generations. Archaeological excavations discovered a sharpened kangaroo bone with ochre tip, dating back 30,000 years. Plated human hair recovered from the caves contained DNA linking directly to living PKKP members. The cultural sequence documented changes in local fauna and climate over an almost unimaginable span of human history. Rio Tinto had legal permission to blast the caves. The Western Australian government granted ministerial consent in 2013 under Section 18 of the Aboriginal Heritage Act, 1972. Archaeological excavations in 2014 revealed the caves were far older and more significant than previously known. The PKKP people said many times they wanted to preserve the site. They issued an urgent request to halt the explosives just 5 days before detonation. None of that mattered legally. Once ministerial consent was granted under Western Australian law, it could not be revoked even if new information emerged. Rio Tinto proceeded with the blast. The caves were destroyed to access 8 million tons of iron ore, worth approximately $135 million. Company executives later testified they did not learn of the site's full significance until days before the blast. The international outcry was immediate and severe. Rio Tinto's CEO Jean-Sébastien Jachet resigned in September 2020, along with 2 other senior executives. A parliamentary inquiry condemned the company's actions as a tragedy that should never have occurred. The board stripped executives of performance bonuses. Chairman Simon Thompson announced his resignation in March 2021. Internal reviews found that heritage considerations were not accorded the priority they deserved in mine planning decisions. Information about the cave's significance never reached executives who might have stopped the blast. The company's segmented organizational structure meant that personnel managing Indigenous relationships had no authority over mine planning, and mine planners had no knowledge of what heritage managers were learning about site significance. For opponents of Resolution Copper, Juukan Gorge represented exactly what they feared would happen at Oak Flat. Here was the same company, Rio Tinto, that had destroyed 46,000-year-old sacred caves for economic gain, now seeking to obliterate another Indigenous sacred site for the copper beneath it. The precedent could not be more troubling or the parallels more direct. Rio Tinto has pledged to do better. The company committed to building relationships with traditional owners, getting Indigenous people into leadership roles, and ensuring that Juukan Gorge could never happen again. At Resolution, the company emphasizes over 500 consultation meetings with tribal representatives since 2004, agreements with affected tribes for cultural heritage preservation, and a commitment to seek consent before any final investment decision, consistent with International Council on Mining and Metals standards. The financial stakes justify extraordinary patience from the mining giants. Resolution Copper has the potential to supply up to 25% of American copper demand once operational, with the United States importing roughly 45% of its refined copper needs, and relying on just 2 or 3 domestic smelters to process ore. Resolution represents a strategic asset of national significance. American copper consumption reached approximately 1.6 million metric tons of refined copper in 2024. Domestic mine production totaled only about 1.1 million tons, with Arizona accounting for roughly 70% of that output. The gap between consumption and domestic production gets filled by imports, primarily from Chile, Canada, and Mexico. Chile alone supplies more than 35% of American copper imports. The situation is structural. The United States exports nearly half its domestically mined copper as concentrate and scrap because it lacks sufficient smelting and refining capacity to process its own production. Only 2 copper smelters operate in Arizona, and 1 in Utah. American copper then travels overseas for processing, often to China, before returning as refined metal for industrial use. This circular trade pattern undermines any domestic production gains and leaves critical manufacturing supply chains dependent on foreign processing. China controls roughly 40% of global copper refining capacity. The concentration of processing in a geopolitical rival raises security concerns that extend far beyond simple economics. The July 2025 imposition of 50% tariffs on imported copper underscored Washington's concern about supply chain vulnerability. President Trump announced the sweeping tariff following a Section 232 investigation that concluded foreign dependence threatens U.S. security interests. Copper prices surged 13% in a single day after the announcement, reaching record highs above $5 per pound before settling back. Copper's importance is only growing. The green energy transition that dominates policy discussions worldwide depends on vastly increased copper supplies. Electric vehicles contain approximately 183 pounds of copper each, nearly 4 times the amount in conventional internal combustion vehicles. Solar installations require about 5.5 tons of copper per megawatt. Offshore wind farms demand up to 15 tons per megawatt. Data centers powering the artificial intelligence revolution consume enormous quantities of electricity, and the infrastructure to deliver that electricity requires copper wiring, transformers, and equipment. U.S. data center energy demand is projected to jump from 224 terawatt-hours in 2025 to 606 terawatt-hours in 2030. Every megawatt of new capacity requires copper. The International Energy Forum estimates that between 35 and 194 new large copper mines must come online and begin production within the next 3 decades to support baseline projections for electrification. That translates to as many as 6 major new mines per year globally. Meanwhile, high-quality near-surface deposits are becoming increasingly scarce. Resolution's 1.5% grade looks increasingly attractive in this context. Resolution Copper projects that the mine could produce approximately 1 billion pounds of copper annually at full operational capacity. Over a projected 40-year mine life, total production could reach 40 billion pounds. At current copper prices around $4 per pound, that represents roughly $160 billion in metal value. The International Copper Association estimates that production would provide enough copper for more than 200 million electric vehicle engines. The economic impact would extend far beyond Rio Tinto and BHP shareholders. Independent studies project that Resolution Copper would contribute approximately $61 billion to Arizona's economy over its operational life. Tax revenues to federal, state, and local governments could reach $20 billion. Local communities would receive approximately $25 million annually in property taxes once the mine reaches full production. During peak construction, the project would generate approximately 3,700 direct jobs. Long-term operations would employ around 1,500 workers, with each direct position creating an estimated 2.5 additional jobs through multiplier effects in surrounding communities. Community development agreements include establishing a $50 million legacy fund managed by a community foundation to support sustainable development initiatives beyond mining operations. For Superior, Arizona, Resolution Copper represents potential resurrection. The town that shrank to fewer than 3,000 residents after magma closed could once again become a center of copper production. Resolution has already invested millions in local economic development agreements, totaling more than $2.5 million since 2023, in partnerships with the town of Superior and Rebuild Superior, Inc. The company maintains approximately 126 employees working at the site, with nearly 90% living within the Copper Triangle region. In 2024 alone, Resolution spent $136 million on project activities, with 37% invested within 40 miles of the mine site. Local contractors have grown alongside Resolution's investment. The company positions itself as part of the community. The path from current underground development to actual copper production remains long and uncertain. Resolution has stated that even if permits were approved immediately, construction would take roughly 10 years before the mine could begin producing copper. Full operational capacity would require an additional 3 years beyond first production. That timeline puts peak output somewhere around 2038 to 2040, assuming no further delays or legal challenges. The concentrator complex will process ore using flotation, a wet grinding process that turns crushed rock into slurry and separates copper minerals using reagents, water, and air. Copper-bearing minerals attach to air bubbles and rise to the surface as froth, which gets skimmed and filtered to produce concentrate containing roughly 25 to 30% copper by weight. The remaining material becomes tailings that must be stored permanently. The copper concentrate would travel through a slurry pipeline, approximately 22 miles to a filter and loadout facility near Magma Junction, following the existing Magma Arizona Railroad Company corridor. This corridor would also include an upgraded rail line for transporting filtered concentrate to smelters, new water pipelines, utility lines, several intermediate pump stations, and an estimated 30 new groundwater wells along the route. Tailings, the waste material remaining after copper extraction, present their own engineering and environmental challenges. Resolution proposes a tailings storage facility covering approximately 6,400 acres on national forest land about 4.5 miles west of Superior. Managing billions of tons of processed rock over decades of operation requires sophisticated containment structures and constant monitoring to prevent seepage into groundwater. The tailings would be pumped as slurry through a 4.7-mile pipeline from the concentrator to the storage facility. At the storage site, the material would settle and consolidate while water gets recycled back into the processing circuit. Over the 40-year mine life, the tailings pile would grow into one of the largest engineered structures in the region, visible from miles away. Tailings dam failures at other mines worldwide have caused catastrophic environmental disasters. The 2015 collapse of Samarco's Fundão Dam in Brazil released millions of cubic meters of mining waste that killed 19 people and devastated hundreds of kilometers of river ecosystem. The 2019 Brumadinho Dam collapse killed 270 people. These incidents have heightened scrutiny of tailings management practices throughout the global mining industry. Resolution has proposed using filtered or dry stack tailings technology rather than conventional wet tailings storage to reduce the risk of catastrophic failure. Filtered tailings remove most of the water before placement, creating a denser, more stable material that doesn't require a conventional dam structure. The approach costs more than wet tailings disposal, but significantly reduces the risk of fluid release. Water supply adds another layer of complexity to the project. The Resolution mine would require approximately 250 million gallons of water annually in a region already experiencing severe drought conditions. Arizona has struggled with declining Colorado River allocations and depleted aquifers that once seemed inexhaustible. Adding another major industrial water user generates concern among agricultural interests, municipalities, and environmental advocates. To address these concerns, Rio Tinto has proposed a comprehensive water management system, including multiple water sources and extensive recycling. Water from mine dewatering operations would be used in processing. Filtrate from the filter plant and reclaimed water from the tailings storage facility would be recycled back into the mining process. Central Arizona Project water, imported from the Colorado River, would supplement supply. The company has proposed a potential $300 million desalination plant on the Gulf of California in Mexico to provide an alternative water source that doesn't depend on already over-allocated Arizona aquifers. A 190-mile pipeline would transport treated seawater from the desalination facility to the mining operation. This infrastructure would represent a significant engineering undertaking with its own permitting requirements and international complications. The permitting process extends far beyond the environmental impact statement. Resolution must obtain numerous additional approvals from federal, state, and local agencies before construction can begin. Air quality permits, water discharge permits, endangered species consultations, and dozens of other regulatory requirements must be satisfied. Each permit creates an opportunity for legal challenge and potential delay. The Forest Service's NEPA process represents the critical federal permit because it gates the land exchange required for mining. But Resolution also needs approval from the Environmental Protection Agency for air emissions and water discharges. The Army Corps of Engineers must approve any impacts to waters of the United States under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service must complete consultation on endangered species under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. State-level permits include an aquifer protection permit from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, air quality permits, a mining reclamation plan approval from the state mine inspector, and various construction permits. Pinal County must approve land use changes, road improvements, and building construction. Each jurisdiction has its own process, timeline, and standards. The environmental groups have promised to challenge permits at every step. The Center for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice, and other organizations have track records of successful litigation delaying or blocking mining projects throughout the American West. Their legal strategies target procedural shortcomings in environmental reviews, inadequate analysis of alternatives, and failure to properly consider cumulative impacts. The San Carlos Apache tribe, which holds reservation lands near the mine site, has expressed opposition to Resolution Copper. Tribal leadership has joined Apache Stronghold in calling for protection of Oak Flat. The tribe's concerns extend beyond religious significance to include potential impacts on regional groundwater that could affect reservation water supplies, as well as the broader principle of tribal consent for projects affecting ancestral lands. Other nearby tribes have varying positions. Resolution has negotiated agreements with some tribal nations that provide economic benefits, educational support, and cultural preservation funding in exchange for constructive engagement on the project. The White Mountain Apache tribe, for instance, has worked with Resolution on community development projects, including youth basketball court construction. These relationships demonstrate the complexity of tribal politics. where different communities may have different interests and perspectives. Resolution's community investment extends throughout the Copper Triangle region. The company has completed a $75 million restoration and reclamation project on 475 acres of land, impacted by nearly a century of historic mining at the old magma site. This voluntary cleanup removed contamination left behind by previous operators and demonstrates the company's commitment to environmental stewardship beyond legal requirements. The company has invested $750,000 in educational programs at Boyce Thompson Arboretum, the botanical garden founded by Magma Copper Company's original owner. Workforce development programs train local residents for mining careers. Local businesses like 2K Industrial, Superior Environmental Solutions, AutoNetto Construction, and Four Winds Contracting have grown alongside the project. Resolution's economic footprint already extends well beyond the boundaries of its mineral holdings. Rio Tinto's broader corporate strategy positions copper as a priority growth commodity. The company aims to expand copper production from approximately 500,000 tons annually to more than 1 million tons by 2030. Resolution represents the largest single component of that growth ambition. Other Rio Tinto copper assets include the Kennecott mine in Utah, Oyu Tolgoi in Mongolia, and a stake in the giant Escondida mine in Chile. BHP similarly views copper as essential to its future. The company has made significant acquisitions to expand copper exposure, including the multi-billion-dollar purchase of Oz Minerals in 2023 for approximately $6 billion. Both companies' long-term forecasts anticipate copper demand growth, driven by electrification and urbanization. Resolution fits perfectly into their strategic visions, explaining why they've maintained investment despite decades of delays and billions in sunk costs. The broader mining industry watches Resolution Copper closely. How this project resolves will influence investment decisions on other controversial mineral deposits worldwide. Mining executives cite permitting uncertainty as the single greatest barrier to developing new supply in developed countries. Projects that spend decades in regulatory limbo without reaching production discourage capital allocation to similar opportunities elsewhere. Every major copper mine that doesn't get developed somewhere means copper must come from somewhere else. That somewhere else might be Chile, where political instability periodically threatens production. It might be Peru, where community conflicts have shut down major operations. It might be Indonesia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where environmental and governance concerns raise different ethical questions. Choosing not to mine at Oak Flat doesn't mean choosing not to mine. It means choosing to import copper from places where indigenous peoples lack the legal standing. Apache stronghold exercised, where environmental reviews are cursory, where workers labor without adequate safety protections, and where economic benefits of extraction flow to distant shareholders rather than local communities. The total capital cost for mine construction will likely exceed $10 billion. Resolution has already spent more than $2.7 billion on exploration, shaft sinking, underground development, and permitting activities over 2 decades. Construction of the full mining infrastructure, including the concentrator complex, tailings facility, water management systems, and transportation networks, will dwarf that initial investment. Before mining begins, the project partners will have committed resources equivalent to the GDP of a small nation. The economics pencil out at current copper prices. Industry analysts estimate Resolution's projected production costs would fall in the lowest quartile globally and approximately $2,800 per ton. That competitive cost position reflects the deposit's exceptional grade, the efficiency of block caving relative to other underground methods, and the advantages of established infrastructure in a developed country with rule of law. The project would fundamentally alter America's copper supply landscape. Current domestic production meets only about 25% of consumption. Resolution alone could satisfy another quarter of demand, dramatically reducing import dependency. In a world where energy security increasingly depends on critical mineral supply chains, that domestic production capability carries strategic value beyond simple economics. When this mine finally opens, or if it never does, the story will resonate for generations. 40 billion pounds of copper, $61 billion in projected economic impact, $20 billion in tax revenue, one of the holiest sites in Apache religion, the world's largest undeveloped copper deposit, two of the world's largest mining companies, the entire green energy transition's demand for the red metal, a sacred landscape that will be transformed into a crater visible from space, all of it colliding beneath the Arizona desert in a conflict that may never truly be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The Apache call Oak Flat Chichil Bildigatil. The miners call it one of the greatest copper deposits ever discovered. Both are right. The ground holds both copper and sacred meaning, material worth and spiritual significance. How we resolve that tension says something important about who we are and what we value. Resolution Copper isn't just a mining project. It's a test of whether industrial civilization can find ways to meet its material needs without destroying everything else in the process. If you found this deep dive into Resolution Copper valuable, consider subscribing for more content exploring the world's most significant mining operations, the commodities that power the global economy, and the human stories behind resource extraction. The mining industry shakes everything from the devices in your pocket to the vehicles on your road to the balance of power between nations. Next time you flip a light switch, charge your phone, or see an electric vehicle on the road, remember that copper made it possible. And remember that somewhere beneath the Arizona desert, one of the world's richest copper deposits waits in the dark, caught between the world's demand for the metal and the prayers of a people who have worshipped that ground since before memory began.